Hey guys, my name is Matthew. Today we're going to be talking about the differences between Christianity in the USA versus England. We'll also be specifically answering the question from the thumbnail of whether or not England is actually more Christian than the United States. Alright, a couple quick things to get out of the way. The first one is this video is not meant to be evangelistic in nature. I'm not trying to convert you or anything like that. But if you're interested in learning more about Christianity and what makes it different from other religions, here's a great video from a friend of mine. His name's Pete, and he's got a great video on exactly that topic. Feel free to check it out if you're interested in learning more about Christianity. A second thing I want to mention is that the title is specifically about the difference between the USA and England because it's where I've had the most interaction with Christianity. I've had some interaction with Scotland and with Wales Christianity as well, so I'll be mentioning those things briefly, but the majority of the video kind of is focused on England as opposed to the UK in general. So I'll mention some stats from the UK in general, but mostly I'm talking about England when I talk about different aspects of Christianity here. One of the first differences I want to talk about is the actual church buildings, the difference between buildings you'll find in the US versus in England. In the US, we tend to have a lot of, two types of buildings. We tend to have some buildings that are like very small, older buildings that are, older meaning like 200 years old. They're kind of the more antiquated styles that we think of as kind of old in the US. They've got the steeple and they clearly look like they're older. You'll find these really commonly in small towns, kind of these country churches that hold 50 to 100 people, and they still have their pews in and things like that. These churches are largely dying out. I've seen a lot of studies about this kind of small country church that's kind of going to the wayside. And I've actually worshipped in several of these types of buildings. Some of them are being updated, which is great, and they're kind of getting new life out of them. And others of them are dying because the population is getting older in those churches, and they're not able to kind of continue supporting the church and supporting the building. Those buildings are expensive to maintain, and if you're getting fewer and fewer congregants in a church, that can be tough to maintain. A lot of buildings in the US now are newer buildings that are much more modern. I've noticed this is a big difference is you don't see a lot of modern churches in England or in the UK in general, but there are lots of them in the US. And some of these buildings are meant, they hold 500 people, and some of them are much larger, can hold thousands of people in them. They sometimes cross that border between, am I in a church or is this more of like a meeting space, and sometimes that can be really good, but sometimes it can be a little off-putting for some people. In the UK, there are churches that are incredibly old, and I've actually noticed that most churches in the UK do tend to be old churches. In addition to being old churches, they also look very traditional. Most churches that I've noticed in the UK in general, everywhere I've gone, churches tend to be obviously churches. You can see from the outside that they have kind of these structural points that it makes it look like a church. Even old buildings that have been reformed into something else, you can tell they used to be churches. They kind of have this structure to them that just makes it very obvious. One thing I really like about this is it creates a blending between church and history that kind of overlaps. And so a lot of churches end up being kind of caretakers for the history that's going on in the buildings. There's one building that I actually got to walk around and tour in London. It was right near where some bombing happened in World War II, but the church building happened to stay up. And so they've got tons of history that's all throughout. They're open throughout the week and people can go through and look at stuff. And it's really cool how churches can, in some places, actually be caretakers of history in England. And then one other thing that just a big difference you might notice, and I kind of alluded to this already, but churches in the United States tend to get huge when you compare them to the sizes of churches in England. This is a generalization. I know there are some big churches in England, but there are a lot of big churches in the United States. What you would consider a really large church in England is maybe several thousand people, maybe 1, 2, 3,000 people. That would be a very large church in England. In the United States, that's maybe a medium-sized church, and 1,000 would be on the small side of a medium-sized church. That obviously depends a lot on where you are in the States and the number of believers in your area and things like that. But as a generalization, I'd say that churches in the United States tend to get much larger. We have what you call making mega churches, whereas in England, I haven't noticed and I haven't heard about as many mega churches. And when you think about a mega church here, it tends to be something that's got a couple thousand people, whereas a mega church in the United States might be 10,000, 20,000 or more people. I want to get into the question of, is England more religious than the USA? I think the answer is going to be obvious to most people, but I think some of the questions that we're about to approach are going to be interesting because as an American, I've always heard that England is a post-Christian culture. They're a post-Christian state. That means that they're like beyond Christianity and doesn't have a huge effect anymore. And I think there are a lot of ways that Christianity is actually playing a bigger effect in England than it is in the United States. We'll look into some of those here, and then we'll also look at some of the contrary points as well. The first thing I want to say about England that makes it seem like it's a lot more Christian than the United States is it has an established church, the Church of England. That's actually a church that is huge. It's the biggest Protestant denomination in the world. It's not just the biggest one in England, but it is by far the biggest one in England as well. It's big and it's overwhelmingly present, and there are so many, resources that are going out to communities, for instance, the Alpha Course and financial helps, and there's a huge budget associated with it, and the Church of England is absolutely enormous, and it's heavily associated with the government. By comparison, in the United States, the biggest Protestant denomination is Baptist, but only by a couple percentage points. You could easily see another denomination rising up in the next few years and being bigger. There's no clear-cut winner of the biggest denomination, and there's no unified church in the United States the way there is in England. Another point to support that England might be more religious than America is that the Queen herself is both the head of the state and also the defender of the faith. She's also the head of the church in England as well. It's an interesting tie between politics and church that just doesn't really fly in the US, but it is really interesting. The Queen also plays an important social connection to the church in England. Every Christmas she delivers this speech, which for the last 20 years has been focused entirely on the gospel and the Christian message and how that is related to her own personal life. And people from England tune in and watch this speech that's really largely about Christian values. And it's interesting to see how that plays out because there's nothing like that in the United States, that people would consistently watch year over year and continually watch a speech like that. Another interesting point that I just recently found out is that churches in England actually outnumber pubs. Pubs, the things that are like just associated with England. You go to England and you go to pubs, and there are definitely pubs in England, but there are actually more churches than pubs, which is kind of a crazy fact to think about. Here's one that really kind of blows my mind. I really didn't know about this. I have to give you an update from the US actually. So in the United States, we have this thing called separation of church and state. It is kind of this blanket statement that means that the government and religion are two different things, and we don't want them to be owned by the same person or the same entity. In reality, that's like supposed to be the way it works, but in most aspects of politics, it doesn't really work that way. For instance, on all of our currency, all of our dollar bills, it says, "In God we trust." And the Pledge of Allegiance references God, and like people like George W. Bush used to famously say, "God bless America," and all that stuff. So politics and religion get blended together all the time. The abortion arguments and everything that's going on. Obviously, politics and religion get blended in the United States, except for in one place, which is in the schools. In the schools in the United States, there is no religious teaching allowed at all. Over the years, I've heard many stories about a teacher who accidentally stepped over that bounds, and they said they were going to pray for their kids or something. Or they said, "Oh yeah, I'm a Christian, I go to church on Sundays." And they lose their job because of simple step-ups like that. We take it really seriously in the United States, this idea of separation of church and state in the schools, because the schools are largely government-owned. The reason that's important is because in England, you're actually required to have religious teachings in the schools. And more than just required to have general religious studies. It's not like they study each religion equally. 50% or more of the learning that happens in England in the schools has to be Christian. 50% or more. The way I understand the rule is you could actually have quite a bit more. You could have 75% plus of your teaching be Christian teaching, as long as at least 50% of it is based on Christian standards. So around Christmas time, they hear messages about what the meaning of Christmas is in the schools, that all children actually have Christian learning in their schools as part of their curriculum. That's crazy for me as an American to hear that. As I mentioned earlier, so much of what I hear about England is it's a post-Christian culture. We'll get into more about what that means, but that seems crazy to me, that Christian learning is actually a requirement in all schools in England. Okay, so I've lined up the defense about England maybe being a more Christian culture than the United States. And I think that some of those things are really interesting. Like I said, I've heard my whole life that England is post-Christian. And so where did we get this idea from with all these parts of English culture that just scream Christianity? Well, what's interesting is although all those things I just mentioned are totally true for the most part, I know people are probably going to point to some different ways that schools work or the different ways that the Queen has no power or whatever. Those can all go in the comments. I love those comments. Please keep them coming and kind of keep clarifying what I'm saying. But I think it's really interesting that when you talk to people throughout all of England, but also in the UK in general, you start to understand why this culture is considered post-Christian. So everywhere I've been, I've talked to people where I'm waiting at a bus stop or on the pubs or just even on the street. I start chatting with people and they recognize my accent and they ask me where I'm from. I'm from the United States. And they start going, oh, great. And one of the first questions they ask me about is normally about religion. People are really interested in religion in the United States and they wonder, do you go to church and are you a Christian and all these things? And it's great. I love to answer those questions because then it gives me the opportunity to ask them about their faith as well. And I can say this with certainty. 100% of the people that I've met in England that were not directly associated with the church, if I didn't meet them at church or was not introduced to them by a Christian, they are not Christian. And most of them would say I'm an atheist or I'm non-religious. And that's really interesting to me because of all the things I've just said. Even though they're getting all this teaching in the schools and so much of it's coming from the Queen and they're watching these things from, about Christianity that's just so involved with their politics, they still are largely non-religious in England. There's actually just recently been a poll come out. They contacted people in the UK in general, so not in England, but in all of the UK, and they've said that actually 52% of people report as being non-religious. And even among people who report as being religious, 30% of them actually go to church on a regular basis. So it's very evident from the stats that England is not actually particularly Christian at all. The people here report as being non-religious people. That's how they self-identify themselves. And even the ones that report as being religious in some way or Christian, most of those people aren't going to church on a regular basis. England, by and large, is not actually a Christian culture at all because the culture is made up of the people. The people are self-identifying as non-Christian, therefore it's a pretty open and closed case. England is not actually Christian at all. They're losing those roots that they came from, which was that Christian identity. Eventually, their politics and things will likely catch up with that if things continue trending the way that they are. One last really important and interesting thing that I want to mention is I've been going to church regularly here in England. I've also been to quite a number of churches in other places, such as Scotland and Wales, and I have had the opportunity to talk with probably hundreds of Christian people here in England and the UK in general. Also growing up, I went to church in the USA, and I've gone to church regularly throughout my entire adult life as well. So it begs the question, what is different between church in England and church in the United States? Here's something that I didn't expect at all, but I'm really, really pleased by in coming and visiting England. I would say that the vast majority of people that I've met and interacted with who call themselves Christians are what I would call real Christians. Not to be judgmental about whether or not someone actually is a Christian or not, but the way that they're living out their life is very in line with the teachings of Christ and biblical teachings. I would say people that I've run into in England and people who I go to church with, not only are they regularly attending church, but there's something different about their lives. It's clear that they love Jesus. It's clear that they're doing real religion in England, which the Bible defines as caring for orphans and widows. It's evidence that they love Jesus because they're going to charity and they're doing the things that Jesus would be doing if he were alive and here on earth now. In the United States, I'd say that it's a little bit different. Again, not that I don't know Christians who are living out their faith and it's really evident that they love Jesus, but I would say going to church, a lot of people are going to church because they expect that they should go to church, or because their parents always went to church, or because it's just a nice social gathering type thing for them to do once a week. I know a lot of people back in the United States who call themselves Christians, but it's not evident from their life that they're Christians. They look the same as anyone else who wasn't a Christian, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just so clear that in the United States, there's something happening that other people have termed this before called cultural Christianity. And it's this idea that it's appropriate and normal and good to be Christian, and therefore I just will be Christian. But they haven't really decided to fully commit to Christianity in the same way that is necessary in a place like England. In England, if more than half of your friends and family members are saying, I'm not a Christian, then suddenly it's not culturally appropriate to be a Christian. And so if you decide to be a Christian, then you're fully bought in. You go to church and you live that way because that's something that you've personally really decided is true about who you are. And that's an identity you've decided to take that on yourself. In the United States, the majority of people are still claiming they're Christian. The majority of people are still saying, hey, I want to go to church and be a part of this. And your friends and family may still be very much so Christian, and it's culturally appropriate to go to church. Whether that's good or bad, or which one is better or worse, is not for me to say. But I've been really excited about the fact that when I go to church, most of the people, the vast majority of the people around me, are really living their lives in a way that I feel like Jesus would be living his life if he was here today. I don't know if that makes sense, that difference, but I think the way that church works here is more real in some ways because of the culture that we're living in of post-Christianity. The church here is actually maybe more Christian than it is in the United States. I think I got a bit rambly there for a minute, but do feel free to send down your comments below. Let me know what you think about that and if that resonates with you, if that's something that you've also realized if you've gone to church in England as well as the United States. Again, do check out my friend's video. It really is awesome. I'll leave it in the description as well if you're more interested about Christianity, what it means to be a Christian, and what is it that makes this religion different than other religions. That's all for today. Please do feel free to like and subscribe if you got anything of value from this content, and we will see you guys next week.